Boardroom Bound, episode 188, How to Position Yourself Well to Build a Board Portfolio, with Randall Beard.
For anyone looking at joining boards, you have to identify what are the sectors where your experience is going to be the most relevant, and your value proposition and the way you can add board value is going to be most interesting to the company. I mean, that's a critical first step in defining like how you want to play in this space.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we're speaking with Randall Beard, and he has a lifetime of senior executive experience in the marketing space, big brand name companies, and from that has turned into a huge board portfolio, multiple compensated board seats, multiple advisory board seats, and just a lifetime of experience that he's going to share with us about what that means, what it looks like in a boardroom, and how you can best position yourself to land that board seat. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the Modern Board Director Candidate Packaging and Modern Board Operations Knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Randall Beard, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Alexander, thank you. Really glad to be here.
And this is going to be great fun because I think you have in many ways the example background of what people are looking for of like, my gosh, you've brought it all together and you're on multiple advisory boards and multiple boards and you're doing advising for other groups and organizations, and people are going, what was the secret sauce? How did that come together? So I know we're going to have probably a lot of war stories along the way about how you got there. But before we get there, part of your background sort of speaks for itself. And by the way, I love your LinkedIn profile, that image background that you've got at the top, which has your board stuff and the sort of the corporate experience. Like you're really putting it right in front of us to make it very obvious. So great example for someone to go check that out today. And why don't you give us a bit of a background about your career arc, how that came together so that you're doing all the board work you are today?
I've done a ton of things over 35 years, and so what I like to do is simplify it down to 3 chapters, if you will, of my career. So the first chapter is what I call the Chief Marketing Officer, or the CMO chapter. The second chapter is Measurement and Predictive Analytics, and the third chapter is Performance Marketing. So let me just walk through those real quickly. The first chapter, the CMO chapter, I grew up in marketing at Procter & Gamble and then American Express and then UBS, the big Swiss bank. So I spent the first 17 years of my career at Procter & Gamble in brand management and general management, worked in the U.S., Canada, China, and Japan. So I spent 7 years out in Asia. Then I went to American Express. I was the global head of marketing and product management for one of the business units there for 8 years. And then I spent a couple of years as the chief marketing officer at UBS's global wealth management business. So this first chapter is I've sat in the CMO seat. I've done the job. I understand the challenges and the opportunities, both in terms of marketing and product development. And that's a really fantastic foundation. I then jumped over to chapter 2, which I would call Measurement and Predictive Analytics, working at Nielsen for 8 years. And the majority of that time, I was the global head of the advertising effectiveness measurement business. So think of that as measuring audience reach, brand impact, and sales impact of advertising across all major media platforms for every major industry vertical, consumer packaged goods, financial services, and so forth. So I learned a ton about measurement and predictive performance marketing. So I worked at a 10-year-old startup based in Atlanta called Cardlytics as the group president. They power all the cashback offers programs for the major banks in the U.S. And so I learned a ton there about performance marketing and using purchase behavior data, both in terms of targeting and measurement of advertising effectiveness. So those were the foundational 3 chapters of my career. And then currently, as you said earlier, Alexander, I do board and advisory work. I'm on 4 corporate boards backed by either venture capital or private equity. And I'm also a senior advisor to HIG Capital in the private equity space, and then Bain Consulting.
And so, Randall, that fascinating career, and you can sort of see how that pops off the page. Even a finance guy like me can go, okay, this is the marketing, the CMO type guy that you need on that board, right, to really understand it. So you got that calling card quite literally out there. And clearly with your background, you know how to promote that best. Now, for our audiences, they just sort of listened through that sort of career executive type experience. We should sort of talk about how the board stuff came about, right? So I think the first paid corporate board role came just before you joined that last organization at Cardlytics. So maybe you can talk through maybe when you realized this is something I want to perhaps position myself for to do professionally, and at some point became a portfolio, and we can talk about that as well. How did that first one come about?
Yeah, it's a great question. What was interesting for me is when I worked at Nielsen, Alexander, they had 2 ventures that I was able to join as a board member and get some initial non-paid board experience. So Nielsen had a joint venture with Catalina, the Nielsen Catalina Solutions. I joined that joint venture as one of the Nielsen board members. Nielsen also had a trustee position with the Marketing Accountability Standards Board, or MASB. And I was the Nielsen representative on that board. And so I actually got some non-paid, but still corporate board experience from those 2 things. And then was introduced by a friend to Starlight Media, where I joined the board in my first paid board role. And then subsequent to that, there have been several other boards that I've joined. And the way I've joined each one has been a little bit different, which we can talk about if you want.
And so you went from that experience, and you said it so subtly there, Randall, like a friend sort of connected me to it. Let's just call that networking. So I think that's what most people think about, like, how does this work? How does it happen? That's a great example. A friend who probably knew you wanted to be on the board, to be a good fit, knew your background experience. Hey, Randall, you should think about this opportunity that we have here. But at some point, many people go from, I finally landed my first major public company board, if that was what your goal was, and they get into it and they're like, oh, I want more of these compensated board roles. This is great. Maybe someday I just want to be a portfolio person. And that's a very different experience. So can you talk us through, you had a very successful career you ran us through of executive doing stuff and making things happen. You get your first couple of board roles and it's different, right? Nose in, fingers out, different philosophy. I'm sure there was a little bit of a learning curve and maybe some people have a lot of difficulty with it. And now you're at the point where you've got so much board space going on. Talk us through that journey, what it felt like, what was hard, what worked well, what would you do different if you were going through it again?
It actually felt like a fairly logical progression and a set of building blocks, if you will, because if you go back to my corporate career, that 3rd chapter when I was working at Cardlytics, while I was working at Cardlytics, that's when I joined the board of Starlight. So I had one board position while I was working full time. As I was getting ready to leave Cardlytics, I found the second board position, which was with Catalina. And there, an investment banker that I know, actually reached out to me because he knew they were about to look for a new CEO, and he wanted to see whether someone like me with my background would be interested in the CEO role. And I told him, actually, no. I think I'm going to go full board and advisory route at this standpoint, but I'd love to consider an independent board role. And he introduced me to the largest investor, and that's how I ended up joining that board. At that point, I realized I have enough critical mass in board work, and there's enough demand when I talk to people for the kinds of experience and expertise that I have, that I can turn this into a full-time opportunity. And so subsequent to that, I was networking with a friend that I used to work with at Nielsen. She introduced me to the CEO of Keen Decision Systems and said, hey, you would be amazing working with these guys. And they were looking for an independent board member, and I joined there. I would like to just spend 1 second on the last board role that I have with a company called Suzy, which is a real-time consumer insights platform, because the way I got to that board role is a little different. I mentioned earlier I work with HIG in the private equity space as a senior advisor. I work with them to assess and do due diligence on companies they're looking to invest in. And a natural outcome of a successful investment is that I have the opportunity to join boards that they've invested in. And in this particular case, my background and experience was super relevant and highly interesting to the Suzy team. And so I joined the board through the HIG investment in that company.
And I imagine, Randall, for people listening, generally when they think of a board, they think public company. And I guess most people go, I've kind of made it once I've landed that. And of course, public company is so broad, from sort of the smallest, maybe just went public, to the largest mega caps. And we could talk about everything in between. But there are so many more opportunities in the private space, from venture backed to equity to ESOP to mutual funds, et cetera. We go on and on. So when you were thinking about what's the sweet spot for me and what are the types of boards I want to go after, how did you go about trying to figure out what to do? And therefore, because it sort of dictates maybe who you're talking to for opportunities.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point, Alexander. When I look at the red threads that run through all of the things I do, whether they are board roles or the advisory work I do with HIG and Bain, they're all about digital marketing and media, the use of data for measurement and predictive analytics, and new product innovation. Those are the three red threads that run through everything that I do. And when you look at that space where that kind of knowledge and expertise is valuable, there are a ton of companies that are what I would call sort of smaller mid-cap, that are either VC-backed or private equity-backed. Yeah, there's some large ones. Like Nielsen is a good example, right? It was a public company at one time. It's not public currently. But there's just a ton of smaller private companies backed by VC or private equity in that space. And so that's the most fruitful space for me to focus. The bigger point that you're making, which I think is important to call out, is for anyone looking at joining boards, you have to identify what are the sectors where your experience is going to be the most relevant, and your value proposition and the way you can add board value is going to be most interesting to companies. I mean, that's a critical first step in defining like how you want to play in this space.
And Randall, I'd love for you to give some thoughts to the audience, since you are so involved on both of these, between what we'll call like normal or regular boards, the way people think about them, and advisory boards. They are different beasts. They have different responsibilities. Some people might look at it as, I can start an advisory board and get that background experience in order to land, say, a compensated full board seat, but you're doing both of them concurrently. I'm sure in many ways you enjoy different parts of them. Can you sort of dissect for us what it feels like on one versus the other, and maybe ways people should be thinking about using the different opportunities for themselves?
So let me use one of the companies where I'm on the corporate board. I joined the board of the company, and of course we are doing all the things that regular boards do, focused on governance and ensuring that there's a clear goal and set of strategies around where to play and how to win, and making sure that management has the right plans in place, holding them accountable, et cetera, et cetera. All the governance-related things you would expect from a board. Interestingly, though, what this company said to me is they said, look, we're growing really fast. We're really successful right now. We have some unique assets and capabilities. But once we run out the current products that we have on the roadmap, there's a big question mark around how we will continue to grow after that. And so what we'd like to do is build an advisory board to help us in that particular area. And so I actually led the creation, and I currently chair the advisory board that has a clear mandate around informing and guiding their upstream product roadmap. And we actually created two advisory boards in one set of clients that were brought in because they're important clients, they're thought leaders, they really understand some of the key areas that we felt like we needed input on. But we also went out and got a set of non-clients that were experts in the industry at really important areas that we thought would impact impact our future, like machine learning, blockchain, crypto, data fusion, et cetera. So if you compare and contrast the two experiences I just described, the corporate board role is much higher level, more focused on governance and strategy and all of that, whereas the advisory board role, where I'm chairman, is very focused on a particular business challenge that the company has, and they need guidance and expert help on above and beyond the resources they have inside the company.
You know, Randall, I'd also love your thoughts on this because I know you're passionate on the topic about building an effective advisory board. And I say this in a certain way because let's say take a private company. Perhaps they don't have a board today, and the CEO is thinking, I probably need one of those for whatever variety of reasons, more expertise or eventually to phase myself out. And perhaps the rest of the company doesn't feel like they need that, right? It's a bit of a challenge to them, or for whatever reason thought, okay, it's easier, I'll start with an advisory board, going to prove I need it, and eventually grow that into a full board. I would love your thoughts on, how do you build the effective advisory board? And that's just sort of one scenario where it might come about, but what does that look and feel like to you?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alexander. I have served on 4 or 5 advisory boards in my career, and they've ranged from worthless to world class, I would say. And it all starts with being really clear about what is it I want to accomplish with an advisory board? What's the goal? What's the mandate? Be really, really clear about that. From that, once you're clear about what the mandate is, then you can go find the right people with the right experience, the right skills to advise in the area that you need assistance with. And then the third thing I think is that the company that's forming an advisory board has to really take it seriously. And by taking it seriously, I mean you have to really listen, spend 85% of your time listening to the advisory board. Doesn't mean you have to do everything they suggest that you should do, but there's some things they say that you probably should do, and you should take it really seriously. So make it action-oriented, and also be prepared to compensate people, right? Like to get really great advisory board people, there has to be, some reasonable level of compensation, and you have to take it seriously from that standpoint as well. So those are a few thoughts that I have just around, being smart about setting up successful advisory boards.
Well, you've got so much experience in this space in different types of boards and organizations, and even working as a member of, say, some of the industry association type ones. And when you're looking back over your career, growing and developing, you were sort of sharing with me things that you'd wish you'd known when you started your board career. And I think you were saying, audit and compensation committee roles or something I wish I'd known more about. Can you tell us about that and what you're thinking?
I actually chair compensation committees on 2 of the boards that I'm on, and I've learned my way into those roles. So I just wish that I had known more about the compensation committee role in a board, how it operates, what some of the standard practices are, because those are all things I had to learn as I assumed the role and learn by doing, more or less. And so, look, there's always going to be some of that in anything that you do, but I wish I had known more about that going into the roles rather than just having to learn everything on the fly.
And perhaps related to the compensation committee roles, I know you're also passionate about conducting an effective CEO performance review. And this is something I find some boards do very well, and some boards maybe don't even bother at all in some ways, right? The board is really run by the CEO, which can be dangerous. Of course, there's some companies where the CEO is also the chairman, so it's sort of what is the left arm telling the right arm to do. What are your thoughts about how we do an effective CEO performance review?
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this, that there needs to be an effective and objective performance review process for the CEO. It's hard for me to imagine a board doing its role well without having that. And for me, I break it down into 3 parts, just to keep it simple. One is making sure that the CEO has very clear goals at the beginning of each year, so they know exactly what their goals are. Most of the goals are quantitative, but there are often a few qualitative as well. But there are KPIs or specific metrics that we can look at and say, yeah, this is what we want the CEO to accomplish this year. The second thing is, I think it's really important to get broad-based feedback, not only from the board, but also from the executive team. I've had a couple of examples where I've got CEOs where I got feedback from board members about the CEO, and some of the feedback from the executive team that the CEO was leading was completely different from and something we didn't really fully understand until we got that feedback. So I think, getting feedback from the team that the CEO is leading as well as the individual board members is important. And then I think finally a formal written performance review and discussion with the CEO about not just their performance, but also what are they doing well and what do we want them to continue doing, but also what can they do better, and how can we as a board support them with either board-related coaching or maybe coaching from some external third-party source to help them be even more effective as a CEO. So those are the three things that I see as being really critical to the CEO performance review process.
So, Randall, I'll infer from that we're making an assumption here about a very good working relationship between the board and the CEO and the entire executive team, which is what we would ideally have happen, but isn't always the case. And that could be the culture of an organization, or a CEO gets changed and the difference between one or the other. And I'm sure you've been on some situations where, some people might, well, if you ask someone what the top board opportunity skill set requirements are, whatever they might say, the first one might be, well, the CEO, right? You're going to hire the CEO, you're going to nurture the CEO, and sometimes replace the CEO. So what you're talking about here, the performance review, is an essential part of that. Can you talk us through what that's going to feel like for some board members, maybe who haven't been around that table yet, and what they might have to do with the CEO, and it might be a little uncomfortable?
That's interesting. I think trust between the CEO and the board and the individual board members is really critically important. And it makes me think about probably the single biggest boardroom challenge that I see across the boards I sit on, Alexander, which is oftentimes in board meetings, what the CEO wants to do is they want to present the answer versus having a discussion or debate. So in other words, the CEO wants to tell the board what they're doing or showcase their team and have the answer, and they're not willing to actually, discuss the key issues and challenges and be okay with not having the right answer yet. And instead, going to the board and using the board as a resource and having a really good discussion about several alternatives before they then decide on a course of action, which is ultimately their choice. Because I think the board needs to do two things. They, of course, need to provide governance and oversight. I mean, at the end of the day, you represent investors. But at the same time, if there's a trusting relationship with the CEO, they can be a resource that can enable management to make the best strategic choices for the business. But to do that, it requires a very high level of trust between the CEO and the board. Because a lot of CEOs, they don't want to come in without having the answer.
Right. You feel like there's that pressure there. And I would agree with you. I think the best board experiences that I've had were that trusting one where, let's say the week before the meeting, the CEO is sending out a note of like, here are the three things that I need your input on. I need your background expertise. Help me work through these. And he might have some ideas and some thoughts, but he's not bringing what they think is the polished answer. And I find after a board meeting, we're really excited. We rolled up our sleeves. We really added value. This is great. And it feels like a successful experience for everyone. Is that what it's been like for you in the boardroom?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Now, when you think back over those experiences in the boardroom, if someone said, Randall, we're going to bring the next one to you now, and you're going to love it. This is your perfect board role. With all the stuff that you've gone through in the past, the various experiences you've had, you've probably gotten really good at due diligence. So you've figured out, here's the kind of questions I need to ask. Here's the information that I need. And it can vary whether a company's public or private, how much you can find out. But that due diligence process can be really challenging for someone landing their first seat. And you don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to put yourself in a bad environment and a bad experience, because then you're unlikely to be successful and hence probably not going to get more board opportunities. As you are thinking about that, what was the guidance that you might give to our audience about, here's how I would go about due diligence? I'd recommend you do these sorts of things.
That's such a great question, Alexander. I think first of all, I look at what is the core of the business, and is it something I really believe in? To take one example, I'm on the board of Keen Decision Systems, and Keen is a platform that enables marketers to measure the effectiveness of their marketing and then run forward-looking simulations inclinations about what they should do in the future to achieve their business objectives. And I'm really passionate about marketing being evidence based and really returning, at really generating a financial return for the company and generating brand value. And so that's something that I really care about. And so I'd encourage people, first of all, is the business in a business that is meaningful and important to you and you really care about? Number two is, do they have a culture and a CEO that you can believe in? Like personally, I want to be involved in companies that either have a culture or are getting to a culture that I really believe in and can support and feel good about. I think that's really important. And a CEO, obviously, who's leading that business. And then the third thing is, can I really add value? Does my experience and skill set lend itself to a board role in this company where I really think I can make a difference? And if those three things are present, then I think it's usually a pretty good bet that it's something you should take a good look at.
Well, Randall, I'm a big believer that leaders are readers, and everyone should be keeping up with some of the latest trends and technology, whatever it is, the area that you need to bring to that boardroom space so that you're top of your game. And I believe you have a book recommendation that you think no matter what someone's expertise is, everybody should be reading this book to be the best self in the boardroom. What book recommendation do you have for us today?
So my book recommendation is not a book about boards per se. It's a book about how brands grow. And that's actually the title of the book, How Brands Grow. It's written by a guy named Byron Sharp. For any listener who's never heard of Byron Sharp, he is the head of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute of Marketing Science in Australia. This book has created a sea change in the world of marketing because, it really brought data and evidence to bear on the question of how brands grow. And really the title says it all, Alexander. Like, what CEO shouldn't know how brands really grow?
Right.
So the book is evidence-based. It's based on real data, real brands. It provides a very simple and clear framework and a model for growth. And it also establishes important metrics and KPIs so that a company can measure whether they're effectively growing or not. And so, when I read about CEOs and what their top mandates are, almost always growth is one of the top two mandates for a CEO. And so knowing how brands grow empirically, I think, is critically important for any board member, because as a board member, you want to make sure that the CEO and the management team and the business are focused on the right things to grow the business.
Well, Randall, you've given us a lot to think about today. And as I try to think about how to package this up, put a pretty bow on it, I imagine for many of our listeners, they're thinking, okay, this is great. I can picture who Randall is, what his expertise is, how that comes to a board. Clearly, with his background in marketing and whatnot, he would probably figure out exactly how to share with the right people. If you could talk to just sort of the average listener here, Randall, who's thinking, okay, I am this subject matter in X, Y, and Z. I need to begin to share this message out there. What is the best way that they make their own brand grow, right? So that they can achieve that dream that they have of landing that compensated board seat?
So we already talked a little bit about identifying the sector where your experience is most relevant, clearly defining your value proposition and where you can add value on a board. And then I think the next step is creating marketing materials, having a really good CV, having a profile on LinkedIn that really clearly communicates what you are, who you are, and what you stand for. Even things as simple as your email. Like at the bottom of my email, I have my value proposition there. And then being present continuously in communicating all of these things across your network. I'm constantly meeting people in the industry, people I already know, or meeting new people, and I'm proactively telling them what it is I'm interested in doing and why, and the value that I add. And I think if you do those things, you build the two things that How Brands Grow, the book says you have to do, which are mental availability and physical availability. I mean, essentially, it's like, when someone thinks, hey, I've got this board role, who would be some good people to think about for this role? Like, Randall comes to mind easily, right?
Because I just got his
mental
email in my inbox, and I was reminded in his signature what he's all about.
Yeah, exactly. Mental availability is really, really important. So those are some of the things I would think about.
Well, Randall, we were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your journey and your insights to help all of us become boardroom bound.
Thank you, Alexander. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Randall Beard, and you could just hear that he is this chief marketing officer, experienced type person. You can imagine the gravitas he brings to the boardroom, and that's why people probably want them on the board, plus his great networking skills. And in many ways, that's the example of what we all need to be for our own subject matter expertise, that we are known for that, it resonates out there, and the value that we can bring to a board. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. Please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.